The courtroom fell silent as I entered, every pair of eyes fixed on me, watching my every movement as I ascended to the bench in my black robes. My footsteps echoed across the polished marble floor, each step deliberate and measured. I never imagined I'd be here. Not like this. Not with them sitting at the defendant's table, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and horror as they finally realized who would be presiding over their case. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you, Harold and Vivian Bennett, my in-laws, the people who had systematically dismantled my life 10 years ago. They sat there in their expensive clothes, looking older now but still carrying that air of entitlement that had defined our entire relationship. Harold's silver hair was combed back perfectly, his posture rigid despite the circumstances. Vivian's face, though lined with new wrinkles, still wore that permanent look of disdain whenever her eyes met mine. I kept my expression neutral as I settled into my chair, arranging my papers with steady hands despite the storm raging inside me. My mind flashed back to the day my grandmother died, the day everything in my life changed forever. I had just turned 27 when I received that call. My grandmother, Eliza Montgomery, the woman who raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8, had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The grief hit me like a physical blow. She had been my rock, my confidant, the person who taught me to stand tall in a world that could be cruel and unforgiving. "I'm so sorry, Claire," my husband, James, had said, pulling me into his arms as I sobbed against his chest. We'd been married for just 3 years then, still in that blissful stage where we believed love could conquer anything. I remember clinging to him, grateful for his steady presence. "She was all I had left," I whispered. "You have me," he'd replied, stroking my hair. "You'll always have me." The funeral was a small, somber affair. My grandmother had been a private person, but respected throughout our small town of Lakeside. As the only surviving relative, I stood alone by her casket, accepting condolences from neighbors and friends who had known her for decades. Harold and Vivian arrived late, making an entrance as always. They barely acknowledged me before taking seats in the back row. They had never approved of James marrying me, a girl from the wrong side of town with no family connections or fortune to offer. In their eyes, I had trapped their golden boy with my ordinary looks and a teaching job at the local high school. "They're just here to support us," James whispered, squeezing my hand. But I knew better. The Bennetts never did anything without purpose. 2 days after the funeral, I received a call from my grandmother's attorney, asking me to come to his office for the reading of the will. I hadn't expected much, maybe her modest house and a few family heirlooms. Grandma had lived simply, working as a librarian all her life. "Would you like me to come with you?" James offered. I nodded gratefully. "Please, I don't think I can do this alone." We arrived at the small law office on Main Street, a humble brick building sandwiched between a bakery and a hardware store. Mr. Peterson, a kind elderly man who had been my grandmother's friend for decades, greeted us warmly. "Claire, my dear, please have a seat." He motioned to the chairs across from his desk. His office smelled of old books and coffee, the walls lined with law volumes that had likely been there since before I was born. I sat down, my hands fidgeting nervously in my lap. James took the seat beside me, reaching over to give my hand a reassuring squeeze. "Before we begin," Mr. Peterson said, placing his reading glasses on his nose, "your grandmother wanted me to give you this." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in my grandmother's elegant handwriting. My hands trembled as I took it. "Should I read it now?" "Perhaps later, in private," he suggested with a gentle smile. "Now, regarding the will," he cleared his throat and began reading the formal legal document. Most of it was standard language that washed over me, until I heard something that made me sit upright. And to my beloved granddaughter, Claire Elizabeth Montgomery, I leave my entire estate, including all financial assets, real property, and personal belongings. I blinked in confusion. I'm sorry, what financial assets? Grandma was a librarian her whole life. Mr. Peterson smiled kindly. Your grandmother was much more than that, Claire. Eliza was an exceptionally shrewd investor. She began investing small amounts in the stock market during the 1970s, focusing primarily on technology companies when they were just starting. Those investments, well, they grew substantially over the decades. How substantially? James asked, leaning forward. Mr. Peterson removed his glasses. The current evaluation of her portfolio is approximately $4 million. The room spun around me. $4 million? I whispered. Plus the house and all. Other possessions, Mr. Peterson added. Eliza lived modestly because she wanted to, not because she needed to. I couldn't process what I was hearing. My grandmother, who darned her own socks and clipped coupons religiously, had been sitting on a fortune all this time? The woman who drove the same old Volvo for 20 years and refused to replace her ancient television until it completely died was a millionaire? There's more, Mr. Peterson continued. She also left you her shares in Montgomery Pharmaceuticals. I'm sorry, what? I asked, certain I'd misheard. Your grandfather, before his passing, was one of the founding partners of Montgomery Pharmaceuticals. The company has grown significantly over the years. Your grandmother retained a 15% ownership stake. The company has recently been valued at approximately $80 million. The numbers no longer made sense to me. I felt James's hand tighten around mine, his breathing noticeably quicker. So Claire owns 15% of an $80 million company? James asked, his voice tight with something I couldn't quite identify. That's correct. Approximately $12 million in company shares, though the value fluctuates with the market, of course. I sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend how my life had changed in a matter of minutes. From a high school English teacher living in a modest rental apartment with her husband, I had suddenly become an heiress worth over $16 million. Why didn't she ever tell me? I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Peterson smiled sadly. Your grandmother had her reasons, which I believe she explains in her letter. She was a remarkable woman who valued character over wealth. She wanted you to build your own life, make your own way, without the burden or privilege that comes with inherited wealth. I clutched the envelope in my hands, feeling the weight of her final words to me. I still can't believe it. Take some time to process this, Mr. Peterson advised. There's no rush to make any decisions. The house is yours. The investments will continue to be managed by her financial advisors until you decide otherwise, and the company shares will begin paying dividends to you quarterly. James and I left the office in a daze. We sat in our car for several minutes, neither of us speaking, the magnitude of what had just happened settling around us like a heavy fog. $16 million, James finally said, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Claire, do you understand what this means? We never have to worry about money again. We can buy a real house, travel the world, start a family without financial concerns. I turned to look at him, surprised by the glint in his eyes. It wasn't just excitement I saw there. It was something hungrier, more calculating. But I pushed the thought away. This was James, my husband, the man who had stood by me through my grandmother's illness and death. Of course he was excited. Who wouldn't be? I need time to process this, I said quietly. Let's go home. That night, after James had finally fallen asleep, I sat alone in our small living room and opened my grandmother's letter with trembling fingers. My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer with you, and Mr. Peterson has informed you of your inheritance. I imagine you're feeling shocked, perhaps even betrayed that I kept this from you all these years. Please understand, my darling girl, that this decision was made out of love. After losing your parents so young, you had already experienced how quickly life can change, how fragile our existence truly is. I wanted you to grow up valuing the things that truly matter: kindness, integrity, hard work, and compassion, not the comfort that money can buy. I watched you grow into a beautiful, strong, independent woman who chose to teach because of her passion for literature and her desire to shape young minds. You married James not for what he could give you, but for who he was, or who you believed him to be. Every choice you made came from your heart, not from your wallet, and I couldn't be prouder of the person you've become. But now it's time for you to know the truth about your legacy. Your grandfather was a brilliant man who helped create medications that have saved countless lives. His work continues through the company, and now through you. Use this inheritance wisely, Claire. Remember that with great wealth comes great responsibility. Don't let it change who you are. And a word of caution, my love. Money changes how others see you, sometimes even those closest to you. Watch carefully for those who loved you before they knew of your wealth, and those who will love you only because of it. Trust your instincts. They have rarely led you astray. All my love, always, Grandma. I folded the letter, tears streaming down my face. Even from beyond the grave, my grandmother was trying to protect me, to guide me. Her warning about how money changes people's perceptions lingered in my mind, along with the memory of that hungry look in James's eyes at the attorney's office. But surely she couldn't have meant James. He loved me for me, had married me when I was just a school teacher with no prospects of wealth. We'd been happy in our modest life together, hadn't we? The next morning, I woke to find James on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. "Yes, it's true," he was saying. "No, she doesn't have any plans yet. Of course I'll talk to her about it. Yes, I think that's a good idea." He hung up quickly when he noticed me standing in the doorway. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, his smile a little too bright. "That was just my mother. News travels fast in small towns, huh?" "You told your parents?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. "Their family, Claire. Of course they needed to know." He walked over and kissed my forehead. "They want us to come over for dinner tonight to celebrate." The last thing I wanted was to celebrate my grandmother's death and unexpected wealth with Harold and Vivian Bennett, but I nodded anyway. All right. Throughout the day, I noticed James constantly checking his phone, making brief calls when he thought I wasn't paying attention. There was a new energy to him, an excitement that felt disconnected from my grief. By the time we arrived at his parents' sprawling colonial home that evening, I felt distinctly uneasy. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't quite name. Harold opened the door with uncharacteristic warmth. "Claire, my dear, what wonderful news about your inheritance. Please, come in, come in." The living room was set for what appeared to be a business meeting rather than a family dinner. Spread across the coffee table were brochures for luxury homes, investment prospectuses, and what looked like incorporation documents. Vivian emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray of champagne flutes. "There she is, our little millionaire," she exclaimed with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We have so much to discuss." I glanced at James, who avoided my gaze. "What is all this?" I asked, gesturing to the papers. "Opportunities, Claire," Harold replied, handing me a glass of champagne. "James mentioned you're not sure what to do with your newfound wealth, so we thought we'd help guide you through some options." "I never said that," I said quietly, looking at James. "We haven't really discussed anything yet." "No need to be defensive, dear," Vivian said with a dismissive wave. "We're family. We want what's best for you both." What followed was a 3-hour presentation on how I should invest my inheritance. Harold, a real estate developer, had several prime opportunities for property investments. Vivian, who ran a small interior design business, had already sketched out plans for our dream home that would properly reflect our new social standing. James sat beside me, nodding enthusiastically at every suggestion, occasionally squeezing my hand as if to say, "Isn't this exciting?" But all I felt was cold dread spreading through my chest. These people who had barely acknowledged my existence for 3 years were suddenly intensely interested in my financial future. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind. Watch carefully. For those who loved you before they knew of your wealth, and those who will love you only because of it. I appreciate all this, I finally said, setting down my untouched champagne, but I'm still grieving. I need time before making any decisions. Harold's smile faltered. Of course, but some of these opportunities won't wait. The property market moves quickly. Then they'll have to pass me by, I replied firmly. My grandmother just died. I'm not ready to start spending her money. It's your money now, Claire, James said, a hint of frustration in his voice. And we need to be smart about it. We? I echoed, raising an eyebrow. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Harold cleared his throat. Perhaps we are rushing things a bit. Take some time, Claire. But don't take too long. Money needs to work for you, or it dwindles. On the drive home, James was uncharacteristically quiet. When we arrived at our apartment, he finally spoke. They were just trying to help, you know. It didn't feel like help, I replied, hanging up my coat. It felt like they were dividing up my inheritance before I'd even had a chance to think about it. They have experience with wealth management that we don't, he argued. We could benefit from their guidance. The same guidance that led to your father's company filing for bankruptcy 3 years ago? I asked pointedly. It was a low blow, but the evening had left me feeling defensive and vulnerable. James's face hardened. That was different. Economic downturn, bad timing. Or bad investments, I countered. Either way, I'm not rushing into anything. I need time. James sighed dramatically. Fine, take your time. But don't shut out good advice, just because you're feeling emotional. That night, lying beside James in bed, I felt a distance between us that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps it had always existed, and I was only now seeing it clearly. The next few weeks were tense. James alternated between being supportive and pressuring me to make decisions about the inheritance. His parents called daily with new, urgent opportunities that required immediate investment. I began to notice small changes in our life together. James stopped bringing home his paycheck from the architectural firm where he worked. When I asked about it, he shrugged and said, I figured with your inheritance, we don't need to worry about my small contributions anymore. He started taking long lunches with his father, returning with new proposals and investment ideas. He bought an expensive watch, claiming it was necessary for his professional image now that we were moving in different circles. One evening, I came home from work to find James and his parents sitting at our dining table, papers spread out before them. They froze when I entered, like children caught misbehaving. What's going on? I asked, setting down my bag. Just discussing some options, James said vaguely. I stepped closer and picked up one of the documents. It was a power of attorney form with my name on it, already filled out but not yet signed. Why would I need to grant power of attorney to anyone? I asked, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. It's just for convenience, dear, Vivian said smoothly. Managing such significant assets can be overwhelming. Harold has experience. No. The word came out sharper than I intended. Absolutely not. Claire, be reasonable, James said, standing up. Dad is just trying to help. You're still working full-time, and these matters require attention you can't give them. Then I'll hire a professional financial advisor, I replied. Someone with no personal interest in my money. Harold's face flushed red. Are you suggesting I would mismanage your funds? After all we've done to welcome you into our family? Looked at him coldly. Welcome me? You've barely tolerated me for 3 years. The only thing that's changed is that now I'm wealthy. That's not fair, James protested. Isn't it? I challenged. When was the last time your parents invited us over before they found out about my inheritance? When was the last time your mother called me just to chat, rather than to suggest ways to spend my money? The silence that followed was damning. I think you should leave, I said quietly to Harold and Vivian. They gathered their papers with tight-lipped dignity and headed for the door. As Harold passed me, he muttered, "You're making a mistake. That money will slip through your fingers without proper guidance." After they left, James and I had the worst fight of our marriage. "How could you embarrass me like that?" he demanded. "They were trying to help." "Help themselves, you mean?" I shot back. "I'm not blind, James. They see my inheritance as their opportunity. And apparently, so do you." His face twisted with anger. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you've changed since we found out about the money. You've stopped working, started spending frivolously, and now you're trying to get your father control over my assets? What happened to the man I married?" "I'm the same person," he insisted. "I just see opportunities now that weren't there before. Why struggle when we don't have to? Why pinch pennies when you're sitting on millions?" "Because it's not about the money," I said, my voice breaking. "It's about respect. Respect for my grandmother's memory, respect for my need to grieve and process all of this, and respect for my right to make my own decisions." James ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "You're being irrational. It's just money. Money that could change our lives for the better." "My life was already good," I whispered. "I was happy with you, in this apartment, with our jobs and our plans for the future. I never needed millions to be happy." "Well, maybe I did," he exclaimed, then immediately looked as if he regretted the words. We stared at each other across the living room, the truth of our situation crystallizing between us. James had never been content with our modest life. He had been waiting, perhaps, unconsciously, for something to change our circumstances. And now that change had come, in the form of my inheritance, and revealed a side of him I'd never seen before, or perhaps never wanted to see. The next morning, I called in sick to work and went to see Mr. Peterson. "I need advice," I told him, settling into the chair across from his desk. "And not just legal advice." The kind old lawyer listened patiently as I poured out everything that had happened since the reading of the will. The pressure from James and his parents, the power of attorney document, the changes I'd noticed in my husband's behavior. When I finished, Mr. Peterson removed his glasses and sighed deeply. "Your grandmother warned me this might happen. It's why she kept her wealth a secret all these years. Money doesn't just change how others see you, Claire. It often reveals who they truly are." "What should I do?" I asked, feeling more lost than ever. "First, let's protect your assets," he said firmly. "I'll help you set up a trust that can't be accessed by anyone but you. We'll move the inheritance and company shares into it immediately." I nodded gratefully. "And then?" His eyes softened with compassion. "Then you need to decide what kind of life you want to live, and with whom. Your grandmother hoped her money would bring you freedom and security, not trap you in an unhappy marriage." That afternoon, I met with a financial advisor recommended by Mr. Peterson and began the process of securing my inheritance. By the time I returned home, I felt more centered, more in control of my own destiny. James was waiting, pacing our small living room like a caged animal. "Where have you been all day? Your school called looking for you." "I've been taking care of my inheritance," I replied calmly. "I've set up a trust." His face darkened. "Without consulting me?" "I'm your husband, Claire. We're supposed to make these decisions together." "Like the decision to grant your father power of attorney over my assets?" I asked. "Was that something we decided together?" He had the grace to look ashamed, at least momentarily. That was just an option we were exploring. Nothing was decided. Well, now it's decided, I said. The money stays in the trust. I'll continue teaching. We'll live our lives just as we planned before any of this happened. That's ridiculous, he scoffed. Why would you keep working when you don't need to? Why would we stay in this cramped apartment when we could buy a mansion? I looked at him sadly, finally seeing the truth. Because I love teaching. Because this apartment has been our home for 3 years, and I have beautiful memories here. Because money isn't everything, James. It's easy to say that when you have it, he muttered. Is that why you married me? I asked quietly. Hoping that someday I might come into money? Of course not, he protested, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes that made my heart sink. I married you because I love you. But now that circumstances have changed, why shouldn't our lives change too? I took a deep breath. Our lives can change, but our values shouldn't. And right now, I don't recognize the man standing in front of me. The weeks that followed were tense. James alternated between sullen silence and desperate attempts to persuade me to be reasonable about the money. His parents stopped calling me directly, but I knew from snippets of overheard conversations that they were still heavily involved, still planning ways to access my inheritance. Then, one rainy Tuesday evening, everything came to a head. I arrived home from work earlier than usual, having canceled my last period due to a migraine. The apartment was silent, but James's coat was on the hook, indicating he was home. I found him in our home office, surrounded by papers and speaking urgently into his phone. Yes, I have all the paperwork right here. She'll never know until it's too late. Of course I know what I'm doing, Dad. I've practiced her signature 100 times. Tomorrow morning, right after she leaves for work. He froze when he saw me standing in the doorway, phone pressed to his ear. The blood drained from his face. I'll call you back, he whispered into the phone, then slowly set it down. I stood perfectly still, staring at the documents on the desk. Forms from my grandmother's bank, transfer authorizations, a copy of my driver's license, and several sheets of paper covered with attempts to replicate my signature. What have you done? I asked, my voice barely audible. Claire, I can explain, he began, rising from the chair. It's not what it looks like. It looks like you're planning to steal my inheritance, I said, each word like a shard of ice. It looks like fraud. It looks like betrayal of the worst kind. No, he protested, hands raised placatingly. It's just, you're being so stubborn about the money. I thought if I could just move some of it, just a small portion, into our joint account, I could show you how much better our lives could be. How much? I demanded. He hesitated. Just $3 million, a fraction of the total. I laughed, a hollow sound that held no humor. Just $3 million, to steal from your wife, from the woman you vowed to love and cherish. I stepped closer, picking up one of the signature practice sheets. How long have you been planning this? He swallowed hard. Claire, please, we can work this out. I was desperate. My father's business is failing again. We have debts you don't know about. So this was never about us, I said quietly. It was about saving your father's company. Again, James's shoulders slumped in defeat. Not entirely, but yes. Dad needs the money. He'll lose everything if he doesn't get an influx of cash soon. The family name, our standing in the community, everything. I looked at this man, this stranger wearing my husband's face, and felt nothing but a profound sadness. Pack your things, James. I want you out of this apartment tonight. You can't be serious, he sputtered. Where am I supposed to go? To your parents' house. To a hotel. To hell for all I care, I replied coldly. But you're not staying here. Not after what you just tried to do. Claire, be reasonable. Reasonable? My voice rose for the first time. You were about to commit a felony. You were going to steal millions of dollars from me? What exactly would be a reasonable response to that? For a moment, I thought he might argue further, might try to rationalize his betrayal. Instead, his face hardened into something ugly and resentful. You never deserved that money anyway, he spat. You're nothing special, just a plain, boring schoolteacher who got lucky because her grandmother was secretly loaded. You don't know the first thing about wealth or class. The words stung, but not as much as they would have a few weeks ago. Now they just confirmed what I already knew, that James had never truly loved me for who I was. Get out, I repeated. You have 30 minutes. Anything you leave behind goes in the trash. I watched impassively as he stuffed clothes into a suitcase, muttering curses under his breath. When he was done, he paused at the door, looking back at me with a mixture of anger and something that might have been regret. You'll regret this, he said. Without me, you'll be alone with all that money and no one to share it with. I'd rather be alone with my integrity than with a thief I can't trust, I replied. After he left, I sat in the silent apartment, surrounded by the remnants of our life together. I should have felt devastated, heartbroken. Instead, I felt oddly liberated, as if a weight I hadn't known I was carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. I called Mr. Peterson that night and told him everything. He helped me secure my accounts further and recommended a good divorce attorney. The marriage was over, had been over, perhaps, long before James revealed his true colors. What I didn't know then, as I sat alone in that quiet apartment, was that James and his parents wouldn't accept defeat so easily. That night was just the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch on for years. A nightmare that would eventually lead all of us to a courtroom where, by some twist of fate I could never have imagined, I would hold their futures in my hands. Divorce proceedings began immediately. I hired Meredith Calloway, the most ruthless divorce attorney in the county, a woman notorious for protecting wronged spouses with the ferocity of a mother bear. With her silver-streaked black hair always pulled into a severe bun and piercing blue eyes that missed nothing, she was exactly what I needed. They'll come after your money, she warned during our first meeting, her manicured fingers leafing through the evidence of James's attempted fraud. Men like your husband, and families like the Bennetts, don't just walk away from $16 million. She was right. What followed was a war, not a divorce. James contested everything. He claimed half of my inheritance as marital property, despite the fact that it had come to me after we were married and was explicitly left to me alone. He fabricated stories about joint investments we'd supposedly made. He even tried to argue that he'd helped care for my grandmother during her final years and therefore deserved compensation. Then came the character assassination. Suddenly, according to James's court filings, I was emotionally unstable, vindictive, abusive. He claimed I'd threatened him physically the night I discovered his fraud attempt. He painted himself as a devoted husband blindsided by a money-hungry wife who no longer needed him once she became wealthy. Classic Darvo, Meredith explained. Deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. It's a common tactic with narcissists. The most bizarre twist came when Harold and Vivian Bennett joined the fray, filing a separate civil suit claiming they'd loaned us $200,000 for home renovations that never happened. Money they now demanded be repaid with interest. We have no record of this loan because we trusted family, Harold testified with practiced sincerity. We never imagined Claire would turn on our son the moment she had money of her own. It was a complete fabrication. James and I had never renovated our rented apartment, and his parents had never given us a dime. But the Bennetts were respected members of the community. People believed them. We need to go on the offensive, Meredith advised. It's time to bring out the recording. The night after I'd thrown James out, I'd had the foresight to install security cameras in my apartment, fearing he might return with a spare key. Sure enough, 3 days later, the cameras captured James and Harold entering at 2 a.m. rifling. through my desk drawers and filing cabinets, clearly searching for financial documents. Their whispered conversation was damning. "She must have bank statements somewhere," Harold hissed. "I've looked everywhere," James replied. "She probably moved everything to her office at the school." "Then that's where we need to look next. Without account numbers, the signatures are useless." The recording demolished their credibility. Not only did it prove they were attempting fraud, but it directly contradicted their sworn testimony that they hadn't spoken to each other since. The separation began. The judge threw out their civil suit and awarded me a restraining order against both James and his parents. But the victory was short-lived. 2 weeks later, I arrived at my classroom to find it completely ransacked. My desk had been emptied, papers strewn across the floor, my computer smashed. Taped to my blackboard was a note cut from magazine letters. "Money can't buy safety." The police came, took photographs, filed a report, and ultimately did nothing. There was no proof connecting the vandalism to James or the Bennetts, despite the obvious implication. Principal Morgan called me into his office that afternoon. "Claire, I'm concerned about the safety of our students," he began, not quite meeting my eyes. "This personal vendetta between you and your ex-husband's family, it seems to be escalating." "This isn't a vendetta," I corrected him firmly. "I'm the victim. Here." He shifted uncomfortably. "Be that as it may, perhaps it would be best if you took a leave of absence until things settle down." I stared at him in disbelief. "You're suspending me because my classroom was vandalized?" "Not suspending," he clarified hastily. "Paid leave, for your own protection." "And who suggested this solution?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The Bennetts had been major donors to the school for years. Harold sat on the board of trustees. Principal Morgan's silence was confirmation enough. That night, alone in my apartment with newly changed locks and an active security system, I called Mr. Peterson. "They're trying to isolate me," I explained. Pacing the living room. "First they come after my money, then my reputation, now my job. What's next?" "Unfortunately, I think I know," he replied grimly. "Claire, have you spoken to any of your friends lately?" I paused, realizing I hadn't. Between the divorce proceedings, the civil suit, and the drama at work, I'd barely had time to breathe, let alone socialize. "Call them," he advised. "Right now." My closest friend was Abigail Chen, a math teacher at the same high school. We'd been inseparable since teacher training. I dialed her number with a growing sense of unease. "Claire." Her voice was cool, distant. "I was wondering when you'd call." "Abby, what's wrong?" A long pause. "I think you know." "I really don't." She sighed heavily. "The Bennetts came to see me. They showed me evidence, Claire. Bank transfers. From your grandmother's account to yours dating back 5 years. They said you've been stealing from her, manipulating her when she was mentally declining. That the only reason you got everything in the will was because you coerced her." My blood ran cold. "That's absolutely false. My grandmother was sharp as a tack until the day she died, and I never had access to her accounts." "They had documentation, Claire. And not just that. They said you physically abused James, that you have a history of violence they've been covering up to protect you, that when he finally threatened to report you, you fabricated this whole fraud story." "And you believed them?" I whispered, hurt, slicing through me. Another pause. I don't know what to believe anymore. One by one, I called other friends and colleagues. The story was always the same. The Bennetts had been methodically poisoning my reputation, armed with fabricated evidence and delivered with the veneer of concerned family members, only reluctantly revealing painful truths. By morning, I felt completely isolated. People I'd known for years, people who'd attended my wedding, who'd supported me through my grandmother's death, were now avoiding me, viewing me with suspicion. The systematic destruction of my life continued over the following months. Anonymous complaints were filed against me with the teaching board. My car was vandalized 3 times. Rumors spread that I was mentally unstable, that I'd been embezzling from the school for years, that I had secret addictions. Through it all, the divorce dragged on, with James fighting for half of everything I owned. The final straw came 6 months after our separation. I returned home from a meeting with my attorneys to find my apartment door ajar. Inside, the place had been completely trashed, furniture slashed, walls spray-painted with obscenities, my grandmother's precious photographs torn to shreds. But this was different from the classroom vandalism. This was personal, vicious, designed to wound more than intimidate. On my bedroom wall, someone had painted in large red letters, "You never deserved her money." I sank to the floor amid the destruction, something breaking inside me. They had taken everything: my marriage, my reputation, my career, my friendships, and now even the sanctuary of my home. What was left? My phone rang. It was Mr. Peterson. "Claire?" he said without preamble. "Where are you right now?" "My apartment," I replied, my voice hollow. "Or what's left of it." "Get out of there," he ordered sharply. "Now. Don't pack anything. Don't call anyone else. Just leave." "What?" "Why?" "Because I just received a call from someone at the police department. They're coming to arrest you." "Arrest me? For what?" "Fraud and elder abuse. The Bennetts have somehow convinced the district attorney that you manipulated your grandmother and stole from her estate." "That's absurd," I exclaimed. "There's no evidence of that because it never happened." "They have evidence, Claire. Fabricated. Almost certainly, but convincing enough for an arrest warrant. We'll fight it, but not if you're there when they arrive. Please, trust me on this." 20 minutes later, I was in Mr. Peterson's car, speeding out of town with nothing but my purse and the clothes on my back. "Where are we going?" I asked, watching the familiar streets of Lakeside recede in the side mirror. "To see an old friend of mine," he answered cryptically. "Someone who can help." 3 hours later, we pulled up to a modern glass and steel building in the heart of Boston. The sign read, "Blackwell Investigations and Security." Inside, we were led to a spacious corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Behind an imposing desk sat a striking woman in her early 50s. Her silver-gray hair cut in a sharp bob, her dark eyes shrewd and assessing. "Claire, this is Alexandra Blackwell," Mr. Peterson introduced us. "Former FBI, now runs the most respected private investigation firm in New England. If anyone can help us unravel what the Bennetts are doing, it's her." Alexandra didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Tell me everything from the beginning," she instructed. "Every detail you can remember." For the next 2 hours, I recounted the entire nightmare, the inheritance, James's betrayal, the escalating campaign against me. Alexandra listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against her desk. "They're thorough, I'll give them that. This isn't just about money. It's about destroying you completely." "But why?" I asked. "They could have just contested the will if they thought James deserved a share." "Why this scorched earth approach?" Alexandra exchanged a glance with Mr. Peterson. "Because there's more at stake than just your inheritance," she replied. "Much more." She turned her computer screen toward me, showing a financial news article dated just 3 weeks earlier. The headline read, "Montgomery Pharmaceuticals Positioned for Historic Acquisition Deal." "Your 15% stake in the company," she explained. "It's now worth close to $50 million due to a pending acquisition by a major international conglomerate. But more importantly, your shares come with voting rights on the board of directors, rights that could block or approve the acquisition." I stared at the screen, stunned. I didn't know. I've been so focused on the divorce that I haven't been following the company news. The Bennetts knew, Alexandra said grimly. Harold Bennett has been quietly buying up shares in Montgomery Pharmaceuticals for the past 5 years. He currently owns about 8%. Combined with your 15%, he would have enough influence to force certain terms in the acquisition, terms that would personally benefit him to the tune of hundreds of millions. How could he possibly know about my shares before I did? Because Harold Bennett and your grandfather were former business partners, Mr. Peterson interjected quietly. They had a falling out decades ago. Your grandfather bought Harold out of an early venture they started together, the precursor to Montgomery Pharmaceuticals. Harold has nursed that grudge for 40 years, watching from the sidelines as your grandfather's company flourished while his own ventures repeatedly failed. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. So this was never about James or me at all. James was the perfect tool, Alexandra confirmed. Whether he knew his father's full agenda or not, he provided access to you, and through you, to the shares Harold has coveted for decades. And now they're trying to frame me for crimes against my own grandmother, so they can challenge the will, I said slowly. If I'm proven unfit to inherit, the estate would likely be redistributed. To your next of kin, Alexandra nodded, which, despite your ongoing divorce, is technically still James. The magnitude of what I was facing hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a vindictive ex-husband and his overbearing parents. This was a calculated, long-term scheme orchestrated by a man with both the resources and the ruthlessness to destroy anyone standing in his way. What do we do? I asked, looking between Alexandra and Mr. Peterson. First, we fight the arrest warrant, Alexandra replied briskly. I have contacts in law enforcement who can help us prove the evidence was fabricated. Second, we secure your shares in the company, move them into an irrevocable trust if necessary. And third, her eyes gleamed with determination, we go on the offensive. What does that mean? It means we stop playing defense and start investigating the Bennetts themselves. No one is squeaky clean, especially not people willing to go to these lengths. If they've committed crimes to frame you, we find the evidence. If they've falsified documents, we prove it. If they've bribed officials, we expose them. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. How long will this take? Months, at least. Possibly longer. You'll need to disappear for a while, live under the radar until we can clear your name and neutralize the threat. I looked around the office, then down at my empty hands. I had no home to return to, no job to perform, no friends to rely on. Everything that had defined my life in Lakeside was gone. I don't have anywhere to go. Alexandra's expression softened slightly. I have a property in Maine, remote, secure, off the grid. You'll be safe there while we work. That night, as I settled into the small but comfortable cabin overlooking the Atlantic, I watched the moonlight ripple across the dark water and tried to make sense of how completely my life had unraveled. 6 months ago, I had been a happily married schoolteacher with a modest but fulfilling life. Now I was essentially a fugitive, hiding from false charges, cut off from everyone and everything I knew. The irony wasn't lost on me. My grandmother's fortune, intended to provide security and opportunity, had instead made me a target, stripped me of my identity, and forced me into isolation. As I drifted off to sleep, I made a silent promise to myself and to my grandmother's memory. I would not only survive this, but I would make the Bennetts pay for what they had done, not just for the money they had tried to steal, but for the life they had stolen from me. I had no way of knowing then that keeping that promise would take almost a decade of my life, lead me down a path I never could have imagined, and ultimately, place me in a position of power over the very people who had tried to destroy me. Nor could I have known the terrible choice that awaited me at the end of that path. Life in exile became my new normal. The cabin in Maine was rustic but well-equipped, with a generator, satellite internet, and enough security features to rival a small fortress. Alexandra had clearly designed it as a safe house, though I never asked why someone like her needed such a place. Some questions were better left unasked. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. I spent my time reading voraciously, taking long walks along the rocky shoreline, and communicating with Alexandra and Mr. Peterson through encrypted channels. The outside world felt increasingly distant, like a life I'd watched in a movie rather than one I'd actually lived. 4 months into my isolation, Alexandra arranged a secure video call. "We've made progress," she announced without preamble, her face serious on my laptop screen. "We've traced the fabricated evidence back to a private investigator named Donovan Wright. He specializes in creating false paper trails, doctored photographs, and forged documents for wealthy clients." "Can we prove the Bennetts hired him?" I asked. "Not yet. Wright is extremely cautious. He uses multiple cutouts and proxies for all his transactions. But we're getting closer. One of his former employees has agreed to talk in exchange for immunity on another matter." Another month passed before the next significant breakthrough. This time it was Mr. Peterson who contacted me, his usually calm demeanor visibly excited. "We found something in your grandmother's personal effects," he said, holding up a small leather-bound journal. Diary she kept during the last year of her life. There are multiple entries expressing concern about James and his parents. She was suspicious of their sudden interest in her health and financial affairs. My heart raced. "She knew, she suspected," he corrected, "but more importantly, she documented several instances when she caught James searching through her home, office, and she recorded conversations with Harold where he made thinly veiled inquiries about her holdings in Montgomery Pharmaceuticals. Will this be enough to clear me?" "Not by itself," he admitted. "But combined with the trail we're building from Wright to the Bennetts, it's another piece of the puzzle." The investigation continued painstakingly slowly. Alexandra's team uncovered wire transfers from shell companies linked to Harold Bennett to accounts associated with Wright. They found witnesses who had seen James and his father meeting with the corrupt investigator. Bit by bit, they assembled evidence of the conspiracy against me. But the Bennetts were always one step ahead. Every time Alexandra thought we were close to a breakthrough, key evidence would mysteriously disappear, witnesses would suddenly recant their statements, or new obstacles would emerge. "They have connections everywhere," Alexandra explained during one particularly frustrating update. "Police departments, the DA's office, even the state attorney general's staff. Harold Bennett has spent decades building a network of influence through political donations and strategic favors." "So we can never win?" I asked, despair creeping into my voice. "I didn't say that," she replied sharply. "I said it's difficult, but difficult isn't impossible." It was during this conversation that Alexandra first proposed the idea that would ultimately change the trajectory of my life. "Have you ever considered law school?" she asked, seemingly out of nowhere. I blinked in surprise. "Law school? Why would I?" "Because this fight isn't going to be over quickly," she interrupted, "and you're extremely intelligent with time on your hands. Instead of just hiding and waiting, why not use this period to arm yourself with the very tools the Bennetts are using against you?" The suggestion took root in my mind, growing from an idle thought into a compelling vision. I had always loved learning, had excelled academically throughout my life. Teaching literature had been fulfilling, but perhaps there was another path. Now, one that could help me not only fight my own battles, but eventually help others in similar situations. 2 weeks later, I was enrolled in an online law program under a new identity Alexandra had created for me. Catherine Lawson, a reclusive writer working on her debut novel in coastal Maine. My transformation had begun. Law school was a revelation. I discovered that my analytical mind, honed through years of dissecting literature, was perfectly suited to the rigors of legal reasoning. I found genuine fascination in constitutional law, civil procedure, criminal justice, and especially in the ethical frameworks that underpinned the entire system. While I studied, Alexandra's investigation continued. By the end of my first year of law school, they had finally secured concrete evidence linking Harold Bennett to the falsified documents used to obtain the arrest warrant against me. "We have enough to approach the district attorney," Alexandra announced during one of our weekly calls. "Not to completely exonerate you yet, but enough to create serious doubt about the charges and start an investigation into Wright and potentially the Bennetts." "What does that mean for me?" I asked. "It means you might be able to come out of hiding soon, though the fight will be far from over." 2 weeks later, the arrest warrant against me was quietly withdrawn, pending further investigation. The charges weren't dropped, not yet, but I was no longer actively being pursued. It was a small victory, but significant. I remained in Maine, continuing my legal studies while Alexandra and Mr. Peterson pressed forward with building our case. The Montgomery Pharmaceuticals acquisition had gone through without Harold Bennett, getting the controlling influence he sought. My shares, safely locked in an irrevocable trust, had ballooned in value to nearly $70 million. "He's furious," Alexandra reported with grim satisfaction. "The acquisition went through without his preferred terms, and he's lost millions in potential profits. He's blaming everyone, the company board, the acquiring firm, his own advisors, but mostly you." "Will he come after me again?" I asked. "Almost certainly, but we're better prepared now, and so are you." She was right. I was no longer the naive schoolteacher who had stumbled unwittingly into a decades-old vendetta. I was becoming something new, someone stronger, sharper, more strategic. Each legal principle I mastered felt like another piece of armor. Each case study I analyzed was another weapon in my arsenal. By the time I completed my law degree, 3 years had passed since I'd fled Lakeside. The world had moved on without me. My divorce from James had been finalized in absentia. The house I grew up in, left to me by my grandmother, had been sold at auction after years of property tax delinquency, another casualty of my forced absence. Alexandra had been keeping tabs on the key players. James had remarried, a young paralegal, from his father's legal team. Harold's business had suffered significant setbacks, though he maintained his public image as a pillar of the community. Vivian had thrown herself into local politics, running for city council on a platform of traditional family values. "They've moved on," Alexandra observed. "They think they've won." "They haven't," I replied simply. With my law degree complete, it was time for the next phase of our strategy. I passed the bar exam with flying colors, and with Alexandra's connections, secured a position at the State Attorney General's office under my new identity of Catherine Lawson. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would work from within the system that had failed me, building a reputation for integrity and legal excellence, while gradually gaining access to the evidence we needed to completely clear my name and expose the Bennett's crimes. My first 2 years as a prosecutor were focused on white-collar crimes, money, laundering, fraud, embezzlement. I threw myself into the work, not just as cover for my true agenda, but because I found genuine purpose in it. Each successful prosecution felt like a small blow against people like the Bennetts who believed their wealth and connections placed them above the law. In my 3rd year, an opportunity arose that would prove pivotal. The Attorney General's office launched a special task force investigating corruption in the state's criminal justice system, judges taking bribes, evidence tampering, witness intimidation. I volunteered immediately and was assigned to a team examining suspicious patterns in evidence handling across several counties, including Lakeside. "Be careful," Alexandra warned when I told her about the assignment. "You'll be directly investigating the very systems the Bennetts have corrupted. If anyone recognizes you—" "They won't," I assured her. "It's been 5 years. I've changed my appearance, my name, my entire demeanor. Even James wouldn't recognize me now." I spoke with confidence, but Alexandra's concern was valid. The closer I got to Lakeside, the greater the risk of exposure. Yet it was a risk I had to take. This task force represented our best chance to uncover official documentation of the corruption that had enabled the Bennett's campaign against me. The investigation took me back to Lakeside for the first time in half a decade. Driving past familiar landmarks felt surreal. The high school where I'd taught, the coffee shop where James had proposed, the park where my grandmother had taken me as a child. Everything looked smaller somehow, less significant than in my memories. Maintained my cover flawlessly, interviewing court clerks, evidence technicians, and legal administrators with professional detachment. No one gave me a second glance. Catherine Lawson, with her sleek bob and designer suits, bore little resemblance to Claire Montgomery, the modest English teacher who had disappeared years ago. 6 months into the investigation, we hit pay dirt. A junior clerk in the evidence room, eager to impress the state prosecutor, mentioned unusual procedures surrounding certain high-profile cases. Like what? I asked, keeping my tone casual. Well, he lowered his voice. Sometimes evidence gets logged but never actually makes it to the secure storage, or new evidence appears in files that wasn't there during the initial processing. Do you have specific examples? The clerk hesitated, then nodded. There was this big case about 5 years ago. Woman named Montgomery, supposed to have defrauded her grandmother or something. The evidence against her looked solid in the system, but I never actually saw half the documents that were supposedly logged. My pulse quickened, but I maintained my professional demeanor. Interesting. Could you pull those records for me? For the task force investigation, of course. I can try, he said nervously. But I should warn you, anything involving the Bennetts tends to create problems for people who ask too many questions. The Bennetts? I echoed innocently. Harold Bennett, big shot developer. Has half the courthouse in his pocket. I nodded thoughtfully. Well, that's exactly the sort of thing our task force is investigating. Corruption doesn't work if everyone stays silent. The clerk looked at me with new respect. Give me a day. I'll get you what I can. True to his word, the next day he provided me with internal logs showing discrepancies in the evidence handling for my case. Documents had been added after the fact other evidence had mysteriously disappeared, and the chain of custody had been broken multiple times. All serious procedural violations that called the entire case into question. More importantly, several of these irregularities had been authorized by signature from the district attorney himself, with notations referencing special handling requested by HB. It was the smoking gun we'd been searching for all these years, proof of Harold Bennett's direct interference in my case. I immediately made copies of everything and sent them securely to Alexandra and Mr. Peterson. That evening, we held an emergency conference call. This is it, Alexandra said, her usual stoicism giving way to genuine excitement. With this documentation, we can file motions to dismiss all charges against you and initiate an investigation into the DA and Harold Bennett for corruption and tampering with evidence. There's more, I told them. The task force has uncovered similar patterns in at least a dozen other cases involving Bennett's business interests or personal vendettas. This isn't isolated. It's systematic corruption spanning years. You've done incredible work, Mr. Peterson said, his voice thick with emotion. Your grandmother would be so proud. The praise warmed me, but I knew we weren't finished yet. What's our next move? We take this to the Attorney General directly, Alexandra replied. With evidence this compelling, he'll have no choice but to act, regardless of Bennett's connections. She was right. Within weeks, the Attorney General had launched a comprehensive investigation into corruption in Lakeside County. The district attorney was placed on administrative leave. Evidence technicians and court clerks were being interviewed. And search warrants were issued for Harold Bennett's business records and personal communications. The investigation quickly expanded beyond my case, uncovering a pattern of corruption, bribery, and evidence tampering spanning more than a decade. Harold Bennett had effectively purchased a private justice system, using his wealth and connections to manipulate legal outcomes in his favor and against his enemies. For me personally, the most significant development came 6 months into the investigation, when all charges against Claire Montgomery were officially dismissed and my record was expunged. I was legally exonerated, my name cleared at last. Yet I chose not to reclaim my old identity immediately. Catherine Lawson had become more than just a cover. She was a respected prosecutor with a promising career. And there was still work to be done. The investigation is building toward indictments, I explained to Alexandra when she questioned my decision to remain undercover. If I reveal myself now, it could compromise the entire case. They could claim it's all a personal vendetta. It is personal, she pointed out. Yes, but it's also about justice. Not just for me, but for everyone the Bennetts have harmed. The corruption investigation continued for another year, gathering evidence methodically and building an airtight case. I remained with the task force, now its de facto leader, guiding the investigation with a clear vision of the justice we sought. Finally, in the spring of the 7th year since my world had imploded, the grand jury returned indictments against Harold and Vivian Bennett for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and a host of related charges. James was indicted as an accessory and co-conspirator. The arrests made national news. The Bennetts, once pillars of the community, were led away in handcuffs, their carefully constructed facade of respectability shattered. Their mugshots appeared on every local news channel and newspaper. It should have felt like victory. It should have felt like closure. Instead, I found myself strangely hollow, watching the footage of their arrests with detachment. 7 years of my life had been consumed by this fight, this quest for justice. Now that it was reaching its conclusion, I wondered what would remain for me afterward. The answer came unexpectedly, in the form of a phone call from the governor's office. Ms. Lawson, the chief of staff began, the governor has been following your work on the corruption task force with great interest. The thoroughness of your investigation and your commitment to justice have been nothing short of remarkable. Thank you. You? I replied cautiously. It was a team effort. Nevertheless, your leadership was key, which is why the governor would like to discuss an opportunity with you. There's a judicial vacancy in the circuit court covering Lakeside County. Given the extent of corruption we've uncovered there, we need someone of unimpeachable integrity to help rebuild public trust in the system. I sat in stunned silence, processing what she was suggesting. The governor believes you would be an excellent candidate for appointment to the bench, Ms. Lawson. Would you be interested in discussing this further? A judgeship. The ultimate position from which to ensure justice was properly served. It was an opportunity I had never anticipated, yet it felt strangely like destiny. Yes, I heard myself say. I would be very interested. What I didn't say, what I couldn't say, was that accepting this position would create the most extraordinary twist in my long saga with the Bennetts. Because if I became a judge in the Lakeside Circuit, there was a very real possibility that I would preside over their criminal trials. I would be forced to decide the fate of the very people who had tried to destroy me, while they remained unaware of who was truly sitting in judgment of them. The ethical implications were staggering. The personal reckoning, profound. Yet even as these concerns swirled in my mind, I knew with absolute certainty that I would accept the governor's offer. Not for revenge, but for something more fundamental, the chance to ensure that justice, real justice, would finally be served. What I didn't know then was just how directly my past and present would collide, or the impossible choice that awaited, me on the other side of the bench. The judicial robes felt heavy on my shoulders the first time I wore them, the weight of responsibility almost tangible as I took my place on the bench. Judge Catherine Lawson of the Lakeside Circuit Court, my new identity now official, confirmed by the state Senate in a near-unanimous vote following the governor's appointment. My investiture ceremony was well attended by state officials, fellow judges, and legal professionals, all eager to welcome the prosecutor who had helped expose corruption in their midst. The irony that none of them knew my true identity wasn't lost on me. Alexandra was there, seated discreetly in the back row. Mr. Peterson had traveled from Lakeside for the occasion. One of the few people who knew Catherine Lawson and Claire Montgomery were one and the same. They both offered warm congratulations afterward, their pride evident yet tempered by awareness of the complex path that had led me here. "Are you ready for this?" Alexandra asked quietly as we shared a private dinner that evening. "I have to be," I replied, cutting precisely into my salmon. "The state needs judges with integrity to rebuild trust in the system. That's not what I'm asking, and you know it." I set down my fork and met her gaze directly. "You're asking if I'm prepared to face the Bennetts in my courtroom, to preside over their case without bias despite our history." She nodded once, sharp and expectant. "I've given this extensive thought. Ethically, I should recuse myself if their case comes before me. The conflict of interest is undeniable." I paused, taking a sip of water. "Yet, practically speaking, if I recuse myself, I'll need to explain why. That would mean revealing my true identity prematurely, potentially compromising the whole prosecution." "A difficult position," she acknowledged. "Beyond difficult, nearly impossible. But I've decided that if their case is assigned to me, I will preside with absolute fairness. Not because they deserve it, but because justice does. I will be more rigorous in applying the law in their case than in any other, ensuring that every ruling can withstand the most intense scrutiny." Alexandra studied me intently. "You've changed, Claire." "Catherine," I corrected automatically. Faint smile crossed her face. "See what I mean?" Perhaps she was right. The woman I had been, trusting, naive, ruled by emotion, was gone, replaced by someone who viewed the world through the clear lens of legal principle and ethical obligation. I had been forged by adversity into something harder, more precise, more deliberate in every action and decision. My first months on the bench passed smoothly. I heard cases ranging from minor civil disputes to serious felonies, establishing a reputation for meticulous attention to detail and unflinching application of the law. Attorneys appearing before me quickly learned I had little patience for technical violations or procedural shortcuts, regardless of which side committed them. "Judge Lawson runs the tightest courtroom in the circuit," I overheard one prosecutor tell a colleague in the hallway. "Cross every T, dot every I, or she'll hand you your head." The comment pleased me. Precision and fairness were my shields against any future accusations of impropriety, especially important given what I knew was coming. The Bennett's case progressed through the system with the methodical pace typical of complex white-collar prosecutions. Motions and counter-motions, discovery battles, attempts to suppress evidence. Their high-priced defense team threw every obstacle they could muster against the state's case, but the evidence was simply too substantial to overcome. Then came the day I had anticipated and dreaded in equal measure. My judicial assistant knocked on my chamber door, a stack of files in her arms. "New case assignments, Your Honor. Major corruption case just got transferred to your docket, Bennett et al. Versus State." My expression remained neutral as I accepted the files, thanking her with a calm I didn't feel. After she left, I sat motionless, at my desk, staring at the name embossed on the case folder. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Legally, I had 3 options: preside over the case with scrupulous fairness, recuse myself with a vague explanation citing personal knowledge of the parties, or reveal my true identity and definitely recuse, based on clear conflict of interest. The third option would likely derail the prosecution entirely. The defense would argue that the entire corruption investigation had been a personal vendetta, tainted from the start. The second option would raise questions I wasn't prepared to answer, possibly leading to the same outcome as the third, which left only the first, the most difficult path, but the one that best served justice. I spent that evening reviewing every ethical guideline, every judicial standard of conduct, searching for clarity. By morning, my resolve was firm. I would hear the case, applying the highest standards of judicial integrity to every ruling. I would be harder on the prosecution than on the defense, demanding they prove every element beyond any possible doubt. If the Bennetts were convicted, it would be because the evidence demanded it, not because of any action or bias on my part. 2 weeks later, Harold and Vivian Bennett entered my courtroom for pretrial motions, followed by their son James and a team of 4 defense attorneys. They looked older than I remembered, Harold's once commanding presence diminished by stress and public disgrace. Vivian's carefully maintained appearance showed cracks, her designer suit impeccable, but her eyes haunted, her smile brittle when she whispered to her attorney. And James, my ex-husband, looked completely broken. His shoulders hunched, hair prematurely graying, the confident swagger replaced by nervous fidgeting as he took his seat at the defense table. Not one of them gave me more than a passing glance. Why would they? Judge Catherine Lawson was a stranger to them, just another functionary in the system they once believed they controlled. All rise, the bailiff called as I entered. The Honorable Catherine Lawson presiding. I took my place on the bench, arranging my robes with deliberate movements, centering myself in the role I now played. Be seated, I instructed, my voice steady and authoritative. We are here to address pretrial motions in the case of State v. Bennett et al. Are all parties present and prepared to proceed? Both prosecution and defense confirmed their readiness. I nodded and looked directly at the defendants for the first time. Before we begin, I must ask, do any parties have concerns about this court's ability to provide a fair and impartial hearing in this matter? The lead defense attorney rose. No objections from the defense, Your Honor. And the prosecution? No objections, Your Honor. A flicker of something, irony perhaps, or fate's twisted humor, passed through me as I nodded my acknowledgement. Then let us proceed. The hearing lasted 4 hours, with the defense bringing motions to suppress key evidence and the prosecution defending its investigative methods. I listened carefully to each argument, asking pointed questions of both sides, pushing back on weak reasoning regardless of who presented it. Near the end, the defense raised an issue I had anticipated, a motion to exclude all evidence derived from the Corruption Task Force investigation, arguing it had been improperly initiated and tainted by political motivations. Your Honor, the defense attorney argued, the timing of this investigation, its unprecedented scope, and its singular focus on my client suggests it was never about general corruption, but rather a targeted campaign against the Bennett family. I leaned forward slightly. Are you suggesting, Counselor, that the extensive documentation of evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and judicial interference was somehow fabricated by the task force? Not fabricated, Your Honor, but selectively, gathered and presented to support a predetermined narrative. I see. I paused, considering my response carefully. And the recorded conversations between your client and court officials discussing how to handle evidence in specific cases, those were taken out of context. The attorney shifted uncomfortably. We would argue that those recordings must be understood within the broader context of legitimate business discussions. Legitimate business discussions about manipulating evidence in criminal cases, I clarified, my tone neutral but precise. Harold Bennett scowled from the defense table, clearly unaccustomed to having his explanations challenged so directly. For a brief electric moment, our eyes met. I saw no recognition there, only indignation and the entitled anger of a powerful man facing consequences perhaps for the first time. I denied the motion to suppress, as well as most of the defense's other motions, ruling only in their favor on technical matters where the law clearly required it. By the time we adjourned, the prosecution's case remained largely intact, though I had forced them to justify every element in exacting detail. "Trial will commence in 3 weeks," I announced, bringing the proceedings to a close. "I expect both sides to be fully prepared, with no delays. This court will not tolerate any procedural games or last-minute surprises from either party." As the defendants were let out, I noticed James looking back at me with a puzzled expression, as if trying to place something familiar about me. I kept my gaze steady, meeting his eyes with professional detachment until he looked away. That evening, Alexandra called me. "I had someone observing in the courtroom today," she said without preamble. "You handled it perfectly." "I did my job," I replied simply. "They have no idea who's sitting in judgment of them. The irony is almost poetic." "There's nothing poetic about it," I countered. "Just the slow grinding of justice's wheels." She paused, then asked the question I'd been turning over in my own mind. "What happens if they're convicted? Will you finally reveal who you are at sentencing?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I've considered it. There would be a certain symmetry in them learning the truth at the moment their fate is decided. But it might also provide grounds for appeal, claiming bias that wasn't disclosed." "They tried to destroy you, Claire. They nearly succeeded." "No. One would blame you for wanting that moment of recognition," I sighed, feeling the weight of the past and future pressing down on me. "That's exactly why I can't allow myself to want it. The moment this becomes about personal vindication rather than justice, I've compromised my oath as a judge." The trial began 3 weeks later as scheduled. The courtroom was packed with journalists, local citizens, and legal observers, all drawn by the spectacle of once powerful community figures facing serious criminal charges. Day by day, the prosecution built its case methodically, financial records showing bribes disguised as consulting fees, testimony from court employees who had been pressured to mishandle evidence, recordings of Harold Bennett discussing how to take care of problematic witnesses, documentation of the elaborate fraud scheme they had attempted to perpetrate against me, though I was referred to in court only as the victim in the Montgomery case. Throughout it all, I maintained rigorous impartiality, sometimes ruling against the prosecution on evidentiary matters even when I believed they were substantively correct, always ensuring that the Bennetts received every procedural protection the law afforded. The defense fought desperately, trying to paint Harold as a respected businessman targeted by political enemies, Vivian as an unwitting spouse, and James as a dutiful son manipulated by a domineering father. But the evidence was overwhelming, the testimony damning. After 3 weeks of trial, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just 6 hours before returning with their verdict. On the count of conspiracy to obstruct justice, how do you find the defendant Harold Bennett? Guilty, Your Honor. On the count of evidence tampering, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. The litany continued through all charges for all 3 defendants. Guilty, guilty, guilty. A clean sweep for the prosecution, a complete repudiation of the Bennetts and their years of corruption. Harold sat stone-faced as the verdicts were read, his only reaction a slight tightening of his jaw. Vivian wept silently, her carefully maintained facade finally crumbling. James simply stared at the floor, as if unable to process what was happening. "The defendants will be remanded into custody pending sentencing," I ordered. "Sentencing hearing will be scheduled for 4 weeks from today." As they were led away in handcuffs, James suddenly looked up, his eyes locking with mine. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought he had recognized me. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, followed by the faintest hint of recognition. Not of Claire Montgomery, but perhaps of something in my expression, something familiar he couldn't quite place. Then he was gone, ushered through the side, door by sheriff's deputies, leaving me alone with the weight of what had just occurred and the even heavier decision that now loomed before me. The sentencing hearing would determine not just how many years the Bennetts would spend in prison, but whether they would remain free on bail pending their inevitable appeals. For defendants like the Bennetts, with no prior criminal records and non-violent offenses, bail during appeal was common, almost expected, but I knew what they were capable of. I knew that freedom, even temporary, would give them opportunities to flee, to hide assets, to potentially harm others who had testified against them. I had experienced firsthand their capacity for destruction when they felt threatened. Yet denying bail would be an unusually harsh measure for defendants of their profile, potentially raising questions about my motivations. It was a precarious balance between justice and personal knowledge, between my duty as a judge and my history as their victim. In the quiet of my chambers after the courtroom cleared, I pulled out a small, worn photograph I kept hidden in my desk drawer, the only personal item I allowed myself in my professional space. It showed my grandmother and me on her porch swing, both of us laughing at some forgotten joke, her arm around my shoulders protectively. "What would you advise me to do now, Grandma?" I whispered to the image. As if in answer, I remembered the closing words of her letter to me. "Trust your instincts. They have rarely led you astray." The night before the sentencing hearing, I made my decision. I would pronounce appropriate prison terms based strictly on sentencing guidelines and precedent, no more severe than justice demanded, no more lenient than the law allowed. I would rule on bail based solely on legal factors, setting my personal knowledge of their character aside. And then, only after these decisions were rendered and recorded, would I reveal my true identity to the court and to the Bennetts. It would be my final act as Judge Catherine Lawson. I would immediately recuse myself from any further proceedings in the case, submit my resignation from the bench, and face whatever legal and professional consequences followed. The truth, so long suppressed, would finally be spoken. Justice, so long pursued, would finally be complete. And I would finally be free, not as Catherine Lawson, or even as Claire Montgomery, but as the woman I had become through this long crucible of fire. Someone who understood that true justice sometimes required the heaviest of personal sacrifices. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt strangely peaceful. Tomorrow would bring an end to this chapter of my life, one way or another. Whatever came after, I would face it with the same resilience that had carried me this far. What I couldn't know was that fate had one final twist awaiting me in that courtroom, a development that would force me to make the most agonizing decision of my life, testing the very limits of my commitment to justice over vengeance. The morning of the sentencing hearing dawned gray and rainy, the weather matching the solemnity of what lay ahead. I dressed with particular care, selecting a conservative charcoal suit beneath my judicial robes. Today would be my last day on the bench, and I wanted to comport myself with the dignity the position deserved, even in its final hours. I arrived at the courthouse early, nodding to the security officers who had come to know me as the punctual private Judge Lawson. In my chambers, I reviewed my prepared sentencing statement one final time, ensuring it reflected only the law, precedent, and the jury's findings. Nothing of my personal history with the defendants. At precisely 9 a.m., I entered the courtroom. It was even more crowded than during the trial, packed with journalists, legal observers, and citizens eager to witness the downfall of Lakeside's once untouchable power family. "All rise," the bailiff called. "The Honorable Catherine Lawson, presiding in the matter of State versus Bennett et al." I took my seat and surveyed the room with practiced judicial detachment. "Be seated," I instructed, my voice steady despite the momentous nature of what was to come. The Bennetts were brought in from holding, no longer in their tailored designer clothes, but in county-issued orange jumpsuits, a visual reminder of their fall from grace. Harold's face was set in grim defiance, Vivian's in barely restrained despair. James looked hollowed out, a shell of the confident man I had once believed I loved. We are here for sentencing in case number 2022 CR 0475, I began, following the ritual language that had become second nature over my years on the bench. The defendants have been found guilty by a jury of their peers on all counts as charged. Before pronouncing sentence, does the prosecution wish to make a statement? The lead prosecutor, Sarah Daniels, rose. I had come to respect her thoroughness and integrity during the trial. Yes, Your Honor. The state wishes to emphasize the exceptional nature of these crimes. The defendants didn't merely break the law, they systematically corrupted the very institutions designed to uphold it. Their actions undermined public trust in our justice system and caused immeasurable harm to countless individuals whose cases were improperly adjudicated due to their interference, she continued, outlining specific instances of corruption proven at trial and recommending maximum consecutive sentences for each defendant, with no possibility of bail pending appeal. Thank you, Ms. Daniels, I said when she concluded. Defense. Counsel, do you wish to make a statement before sentencing? Martin Greaves, the Bennett's lead attorney, stood with the practiced dignity of a man who had represented wealthy clients for decades. Yes, Your Honor. While we respect the jury's verdict, we must emphasize several mitigating factors the court should consider in sentencing. He spoke eloquently about Harold's decades of charitable work, Vivian's contributions to community organizations, and James's previously unblemished record. He cited their ages, their health concerns, and the disproportionate media attention that had already punished them through public humiliation. Furthermore, he concluded, we strongly urge the court to grant bail pending appeal. My clients have substantial ties to this community, no prior criminal records, and pose no flight risk or danger to the public. The issues we intend to raise on appeal are substantial and may well result in reversal. It would be a miscarriage of justice to incarcerate these individuals only to have their convictions overturned months or years later. I nodded. Thank you, Mr. Greaves. Do any of the defendants wish to make a statement before sentencing? Harold Bennett immediately rose, straightening his shoulders in an attempt to reclaim some dignity despite the orange jumpsuit. I do, Your Honor. I gestured for him to proceed. I have spent 40 years building businesses in this community, he began, his voice strong despite his circumstances. I've employed thousands, contributed millions to charitable causes, and worked tirelessly to make Lakeside a better place to live. Have I been aggressive in my business dealings? Certainly. Have I cultivated relationships with officials who could help advance legitimate projects? Absolutely. But the characterization of these relationships as corrupt is a gross distortion motivated by political vendettas and personal grudges. He paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom before returning to me. This prosecution has been a witch hunt from the beginning, targeting me and my family because of our success and influence. I maintain my innocence and am confident that a higher court will recognize the injustice that has occurred here. Vivian Bennett declined to speak, but James stepped forward when his turn came. The contrast with his father was striking, where Harold projected defiance, James emanated defeat. Your Honor, he began, his voice barely audible. I won't stand here and protest my innocence. The jury has spoken, and I accept their verdict. I only wish to say that I'm sorry. Sorry for my part in this. Sorry for the people who were hurt. Sorry for failing to be the man I should have been. His unexpected contrition stirred something in me. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps a flicker of recognition that the weak, entitled man I had married was at least capable of acknowledging his failings, even if only after facing their consequences. Thank you, I said simply. The court will now pronounce sentence. I sat straighter, conscious of the weight of the moment. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. The collective breath held as I prepared to speak the words that would determine the Bennett's fate. Harold Bennett, you have been found guilty of 27 counts of corruption, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. These are not crimes of passion or momentary lapse in judgment. but calculated efforts to undermine the very foundations of our legal system for personal gain. The court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison, with possibility of parole after serving 8 years. Harold's face darkened, his jaw clenching as he absorbed the severity of the sentence. Vivian Bennett, you have been found guilty as an accessory to 16 counts of corruption and conspiracy. While your role was secondary to your husband's, the evidence clearly established your knowing participation in these schemes. The court sentences you to 6 years in federal prison, with possibility of parole after serving 4 years. Vivian swayed slightly, her attorney placing a steadying hand on her arm. James Bennett, you have been found guilty as an accessory to corruption, attempted fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Your crimes, while serious, appear to have been committed under the significant influence of your father. In light of your statement today, and evidence suggesting your more limited role, the court sentences you to 4 years in federal prison, with possibility of parole after serving 30 months. I paused, taking a sip of water before addressing the final and most contentious issue. Regarding bail pending appeal, the court has carefully considered the factors outlined in State v. Harrison, including flight risk, danger to the community, and likelihood of success on appeal. This was the moment where my personal knowledge of the Bennett's character would be most difficult to set aside. I knew their resources, their connections, their willingness to violate legal and ethical boundaries when it suited them. Yet I had promised myself to rule based solely on the law and the record before me. Given the serious nature of the crimes, the substantial evidence supporting the convictions, and the significant sentences imposed, the court finds that bail pending appeal is not appropriate for Harold Bennett. He will begin serving his sentence immediately. Harold's face reddened with fury, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the defense table. For Vivian Bennett, considering her secondary role and less extensive criminal conduct, the court will permit bail pending appeal, set at $2 million, with electronic monitoring and surrender of her passport. Relief washed over Vivian's face as she reached for her husband's hand, only to have him pull away, his anger evident. I turned finally to James. For James Bennett, in light of his acknowledgement of wrongdoing and more limited participation in the criminal enterprise, the court will permit bail pending appeal, set at $1 million, with similar restrictions. With the sentences pronounced, it was time for the moment I had been preparing for, the revelation of my true identity. I had drafted a statement, rehearsed it countless times, imagined the shock on their faces when they finally realized who had been sitting in judgment of them all along. But before I could speak, the courtroom doors burst open. A young woman rushed in, her face flushed with emotion, a manila envelope clutched in her hand. "Your Honor, please," she cried, pushing past the bailiff who moved to intercept her. "The court needs to see this before sentencing is final." The bailiff caught up to her, restraining her gently but firmly. "I apologize for the interruption, Your Honor," he said. "Should I remove her?" I should have said yes. The sentencing was technically complete, the proceedings nearly over. But something in the woman's desperate expression gave me pause. "Who are you?" I asked, keeping my voice calm but authoritative. "Lisa Webb, Your Honor. I was Mr. Peterson's legal assistant." Her voice broke. "He died last night. Heart attack. Before he passed, he gave me this and made me promise to bring it to court today. He said it was vital to the Bennett case." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Mr. Peterson, my grandmother's attorney, one of the few people who knew my true identity, dead, just hours before I planned to reveal myself. "Approach the bench," I instructed after a moment's consideration. Lisa hurried forward, handing me the sealed envelope with trembling hands. "He said it would explain everything, Your Honor. He made me swear to deliver it personally to you today, no matter what." I accepted the envelope, noting, "For the court, Bennett case," written across the front in Mr. Peterson's familiar handwriting. "Thank you, Ms. Webb. Please be seated." The courtroom watched in tense silence as I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and several official-looking documents, their authenticity marked by notary seals and legal watermarks. I began reading, my blood running cold with each paragraph. Your Honor, if you are reading this, I am no longer able to deliver this information in person. I have carried a terrible secret for many years, one that directly impacts the Bennett case before you. Enclosed, you will find DNA test results and birth records that prove a shocking truth. James Bennett is the biological son of Eliza Montgomery, born out of wedlock in 1985 and given up for adoption to Harold and Vivian Bennett, who were unable to conceive children of their own. This means that James Bennett and Claire Montgomery are biological cousins, as James is the son of Claire's grandmother's younger sister. Harold Bennett has known this connection from the beginning. In fact, it was the very reason he encouraged his son to pursue a relationship with Claire, to eventually gain access to the Montgomery family wealth through marriage. I discovered this truth only recently while organizing Eliza's final papers, after her death, but feared revealing it would only cause more pain to Claire, who had already suffered so much. I was wrong to keep this secret, and I ask forgiveness for my failure. The court must know that Harold Bennett's vendetta against Claire was never just about money. It was about claiming what he believed was his son's birthright as a Montgomery descendant after Eliza refused to acknowledge the relationship during her lifetime. May justice prevail in light of the full truth. With deepest regret, Edward Peterson. My hands trembled as I set down the letter. The DNA reports and birth records confirmed everything. Comparative analysis showed clear genetic relationship between James and my grandmother Eliza. Additional documentation revealed a private adoption arranged through an attorney who had since been disbarred for ethical violations. James Bennett was my grandmother's grandson, my cousin by blood. The revelation struck me like a physical blow. All these years, the man I had married, the man whose betrayal had set this nightmare in motion, had been my own flesh and blood, and neither of us had known it. Even more horrifying was the realization that Harold had known. He had orchestrated James and my meeting, encouraged our relationship, celebrated our marriage, all as part of his decades-long scheme to access the Montgomery fortune he believed should partially belong to his adopted son. I looked up from the documents to find the courtroom watching me expectantly, unaware of the bombshell in my hands. My carefully planned revelation of my identity now seemed trivial compared to this staggering new truth. What would revealing everything accomplish now? Justice had already been served through the convictions and sentences. Adding this twisted family revelation would only create a spectacle, potentially undermine the verdicts on appeal, and expose James to a truth that might destroy whatever remained of his shattered psyche. In that moment, I made the most difficult decision of my judicial career. I would not reveal that Catherine Lawson was Claire Montgomery. I would not disclose the contents of Mr. Peterson's letter in open court. I would complete these proceedings as Judge Lawson, maintain the integrity of the convictions, and find another way to reckon with the terrible truth I now possessed. The court has reviewed these documents, I announced, my voice remarkably steady, despite the turmoil within. They contain personal information related to the defendants that is not relevant to the sentencing proceedings, which have already been completed. They will be sealed and placed in the court record. Lisa Webb looked confused, clearly expecting some dramatic reaction to whatever had been in the envelope. The defense attorneys exchanged puzzled glances, likely wondering if they should demand access to the mysterious documents. Before anyone could object, I continued. This concludes today's proceedings. The defendants will be processed according to the sentences pronounced. Court is adjourned. I struck my gavel with finality and rose from the bench, exiting the courtroom with measured steps, despite the hurricane of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. In my chambers, I collapsed into my chair, the full weight of what I had learned crushing down upon me. James Bennett, my ex-husband, my betrayer, the man I had once loved, was my cousin, We shared the same blood, the same grandmother. Our marriage had been unwittingly incestuous, orchestrated by a vengeful man obsessed with claiming a family fortune he believed partially belonged to his adopted son. The grotesque poetry of it all was almost unbearable. I had spent a decade of my life consumed by the pursuit of justice against the Bennetts, only to discover I was inextricably bound to them by ties of blood and a conspiracy far more twisted than I had imagined. My phone rang. Alexandra, no doubt calling to find out if I had revealed my identity as planned. I let it go to voicemail. What could I possibly say to her or anyone else about what had just happened? How could I explain the choice I had made to keep this final, terrible secret? Instead, I took out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing my letter of resignation from the bench. Not because I had done anything wrong as a judge, my rulings had been fair and legally sound, but because I needed to step away from this life I had built as Catherine Lawson. I needed space to process this new reality and decide who I wanted to be, now that the vendetta that had defined a decade of my existence had transformed into something unrecognizable. As I wrote, I realized something unexpected. For the first time since my grandmother's death, I felt truly free. Not because justice had been served or because the Bennetts had been punished, but because I was finally releasing myself from the grip of my own need for vindication. Whatever came next, whether I reclaimed my identity as Claire Montgomery, continued as Catherine Lawson, or forged some new path entirely, would be my choice alone, no longer defined by what the Bennetts had done to me or who they were in relation to me. I sealed my resignation letter in an envelope addressed to the OI. Chief Judge gathered my few personal belongings and prepared to leave the courthouse for the last time. Rain was still falling outside my window, but somewhere beyond the clouds, I knew the sun was shining. It was time to step into that light, leaving the shadows of the past behind. 3 months after my resignation from the bench, I found myself sitting on the deck of a small cabin overlooking Lake Superior, watching an early autumn storm roll across the water. The rental property was isolated, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became treacherous in bad weather, precisely why I had chosen it. I needed solitude to process everything that had happened and decide what came next. The news of Judge Tainchin, Catherine Lawson's abrupt resignation, had created a brief stir in legal circles, with speculation ranging from health issues to the pressure of high-profile cases. Within weeks, I had been largely forgotten, replaced by another appointee continuing the work of rebuilding trust in Lakeside's judicial system. Only Alexandra knew where I had gone. She had respected my need for space, checking in only with occasional text messages to confirm I was safe. I hadn't told her about the contents of Mr. Peterson's letter. I couldn't bring myself to speak those words aloud, to make that twisted reality more concrete by sharing it. The rain lashed against the cabin. Windows as thunder rumbled in the distance. I wrapped myself tighter in a blanket, sipping tea and watching the storm's fury with a strange sense of detachment. Somewhere out there, Harold Bennett was beginning his 12-year sentence in federal prison. Vivian was adjusting to life under house arrest while her appeal proceeded, her social standing in Lakeside irreparably damaged. And James remained an open question. According to public records, he had posted bail and moved to a small apartment on the outskirts of Lakeside, awaiting the outcome of his appeal. What did he know about his true origins? Had Harold ever told him he was adopted, let alone the identity of his biological mother? Did he have any inkling that we shared the same blood? The thought still made me physically ill whenever it surfaced. I had been married to my own cousin. We had shared a bed, made plans for children who would have been the product of unwitting incest. The grotesque reality of it haunted my dreams. A sharp knock at the door startled me from my thoughts. I froze, heart racing. No one knew I was here except Alexandra, and she would have called before visiting. The knock came again, more insistent. I moved silently through the cabin, retrieving the small handgun Alexandra had insisted I keep for protection. Living alone, in remote locations when people with grudges against you were still out there, made certain precautions necessary. "Who is it?" I called through the door, weapon ready. "Lisa Webb, Judge Lawson. Mr. Peterson's assistant. Please, I need to speak with you." I lowered the gun slightly, confusion replacing fear. How had she found me? How do I know it's really you? "I brought you the envelope in court. The day of the Bennett sentencing. Please, it's pouring out here, and I've driven 6 hours to find you." I peered through the peephole. There she stood, drenched from the rain, clutching a familiar-looking briefcase, the same one she'd carried into my courtroom 3 months ago. Keeping the chain on the door, I opened it a crack. "How did you find me?" "Mr. Peterson," she said, water dripping from her hair. "He left instructions. For after you learned the truth." I hesitated, then unhooked the chain and gestured, her inside, keeping the gun visible. Trust had become a luxury I could no longer afford. Lisa stepped into the cabin, shivering. She glanced at the weapon but showed no alarm. "I understand your caution," she said quietly. "I would do the same in your position." I offered her a towel from the bathroom, which she accepted gratefully. "Talk," I said, keeping my distance. "Explain why you're here." She dried her face and hair before speaking. "When Mr. Peterson died, he left me a series of instructions, time-sensitive instructions. I was to deliver the first envelope to the court on the day of sentencing, which I did. Then I was to wait exactly 3 months before finding you and delivering the second part." "And how exactly did you find me?" "Mr. Peterson kept a sealed envelope with your location. It was held by his personal attorney, who was instructed to give it to me today, not a day sooner." I frowned. "That's impossible. I only rented this cabin 2 months ago. Mr. Peterson died before that." Lisa shook her head. "I don't know how. He knew. Maybe Alexandra told him your plans before his death. All I know is the address was correct." She reached into the briefcase and removed a thick envelope sealed with wax. Mr. Peterson's distinctive personal seal that I recognized from official documents he had prepared for my grandmother's estate. "He said you would need time to process. The first revelation before receiving this," she explained, holding out the envelope. "He said it contains the full story, everything he knew about the Bennetts, your grandmother, and your family connections." I stared at the envelope, torn between desperate curiosity and fear of what new horrifying revelations it might contain. Finally, I took it, the weight of it ominous in my hands. "Is there anything else?" Lisa hesitated. "Just one thing. Mr. Peterson wanted me to tell you that he was sorry, deeply sorry, for keeping secrets that weren't his to keep. He believed he was protecting you, but in his final days, he realized the truth is always less damaging than deception, no matter how painful it might be." With her message delivered, Lisa asked only for directions to the nearest motel before driving back into the storm, leaving me alone with the envelope and its mysterious contents. I sat with it unopened for hours, watching the storm gradually subside as night fell, replaced by a crystal-clear sky filled with stars. Whatever was inside would change things again, upend whatever tentative peace I had begun to find in my isolation. Was I ready for that? Near midnight, I finally broke the seal. Inside were numerous documents, legal papers, personal letters, photographs, and a handwritten note from Mr. Peterson addressed to me. "My dear Claire, by now you have learned the shocking truth about James Bennett's parentage, and I can only imagine the distress this has caused you. What you don't yet know is the full story behind this revelation, a story that spans 3 generations of the Montgomery and Bennett families. The first document enclosed is a letter from your grandmother to you, written shortly before her death, but entrusted to me with instructions that it be delivered only if certain circumstances arose. I believe these circumstances have now manifested, and so I pass her words to you as my final duty as her attorney and friend. The remaining documents provide contextual evidence supporting what both your grandmother and I have written: birth certificates, adoption records, correspondence, and other materials that piece together this complex family history. I hope that in these pages you find not just truth, but eventually, peace. With deepest respect and affection, Edward Peterson. With trembling hands, I set aside his note and found an envelope addressed to me in my grandmother's elegant handwriting. The sight of it, tangible evidence of her existence, her thoughts reaching out to me from beyond death, brought tears to my eyes before I'd read a single word. I carefully opened it and began to read. My dearest Claire, if you are reading this letter, then circumstances have forced Edward to reveal secrets I had hoped might remain buried. I am deeply sorry for the pain these revelations must be causing you, and even more sorry that I am not there to help you bear this burden in person. What I must tell you begins nearly 50 years ago, when I was a young woman just starting my career at the library, and my younger sister Marianne was still in college. Marianne was beautiful, brilliant, and impulsive. Everything I was not. While I built my life around books and quiet contemplation, she sought adventure and intensity in all things. During her junior year, Marianne became involved with a young businessman with grand ambitions and a magnetic personality, Harold Bennett. Their relationship was tumultuous from the start, passionate but volatile. Your grandfather never approved, seeing in Harold the ruthless ambition and moral flexibility that would later define his business career. When Marianne discovered she was pregnant, Harold initially refused to acknowledge the child as his. He was already engaged to Vivian Sullivan, daughter of a prominent local family whose connections he needed for his fledgling business ventures. He offered Marianne money for an abortion, which she refused. Desperate and alone, Marianne turned to me for help. I was newly married to your grandfather then, and we were just establishing Montgomery Pharmaceuticals. We offered to adopt the child ourselves, to raise Marianne's baby as our own alongside any children we might have. But fate had other plans. Complications during her pregnancy forced Marianne to drop out of college and remain on bed rest for months. During this difficult time, Harold unexpectedly reappeared in her life, seemingly repentant. He had married Vivian, but they had discovered they could not have children of their own. He proposed an arrangement. He and Vivian would adopt Marianne's baby, providing it with the Bennett name and all the advantages of wealth. In return, Marianne would relinquish all claims to the child and maintain absolute secrecy about its true parentage. Marianne, still in love with Harold despite everything, agreed. She believed giving her child to its biological father was the right thing to do, and that Harold's apparent change of heart meant he would be a loving parent. The adoption was arranged privately through dubious legal channels. Harold already had connections that could circumvent proper procedures. Paperwork was created showing the child as coming from an anonymous young mother in another state. James was born in 1985 and immediately taken home by the Bennetts, while Marianne was told to get on with her life as if nothing had happened. The separation broke something in my sister. She moved across the country, cut ties with most of the family, and struggled with depression and substance abuse for years afterward. She died of an overdose when James was just 7 years old, never having seen her son again after his birth. Honored my promise to keep her secret, even as I watched from a distance as James grew up under Harold's influence. It became clear over time that Harold had never truly changed. He was molding James in his own image, teaching him to value status and money above all else. When James met you at that charity event in 2007, I immediately recognized Harold's hand in the coincidence. He had always resented that Montgomery Pharmaceuticals had succeeded while his own business ventures often struggled. I believe he orchestrated your meeting, encouraging James to pursue you as part of a long-game strategy, to access the Montgomery fortune through marriage. I should have warned you then. I should have told you everything. But how could I explain that your new boyfriend was actually your first cousin without revealing Marianne's secret and reopening wounds that had barely healed in our family. How could I tell you that your happiness was likely being manipulated by a man with a decades-old grudge? So I watched and waited, hoping I was wrong about Harold's intentions. When you married James, I finally resolved to tell you the truth. But then my health began to fail, and I feared the shock and stress would only drive you away from me in my final days. Instead, I did what I thought would protect you. I kept my wealth and business holdings secret, planning to leave everything to you in a way that would be difficult for James or Harold to access. I believed this would shield you from their true motivations while ensuring your future security. I was wrong. Terribly, unforgivably wrong. In trying to protect you from one pain, I likely exposed you to others I cannot even imagine. If you're reading this, then my fears about Harold's true nature and intentions have been realized in some way. For that, for all of it, I am profoundly sorry. You deserved the truth, no matter how complicated or painful. Know this, my darling girl. None of this is your fault. You have done nothing wrong. Whatever choices you make now, whatever path you follow from this point forward, you do so with my complete love and support from beyond this life. All my love, always. Grandma, I set the letter down, tears streaming down my face. The rest of the envelope contained evidence supporting my grandmother's account. Birth records for a baby boy born to Marianne Montgomery in 1985. Adoption papers with deliberately obscured details. Old photographs of a young woman who looked strikingly like me. Marianne, my mother's sister, James's biological mother. The pieces of my life rearranged themselves yet again. James wasn't just my cousin. He was my first cousin, the son of my mother's sister. Harold Bennett hadn't merely been a corrupt businessman with designs on my inheritance. He had been James's biological father all along, orchestrating a grotesque reunion between blood relatives who had no knowledge of their connection. And my grandmother, the woman I had idolized, whose wisdom and integrity had been my moral compass, had kept this secret from me out of a misguided desire to protect me, inadvertently enabling the very harm she had feared. I sat in stunned silence as dawn broke over the lake, the morning light illuminating the scattered documents of my fractured family history. The revelation was horrifying, yet somehow containing a strange seed of relief. The incestuous nature of my marriage to James had been unwitting on both our parts. Neither of us had known, both of us victims of Harold's twisted machinations and my grandmother's well-intentioned secrecy. As the initial shock began to subside, questions emerged. Did James know any of this now? Had Harold revealed the truth in some twisted act of cruelty after their arrests? Or was he still ignorant of his true parentage, unaware that the mother who raised him was not his biological parent, that his father had orchestrated his marriage to his own cousin? I gathered the documents carefully, placing them back in the envelope except for my grandmother's letter, which I folded and placed in my pocket, close to my heart. Her words, though revealing painful truths, also offered a kind of absolution, a confirmation that none of this had been my fault, that I could move forward without the weight of imagined transgression. For the first time in months, I picked up my phone and dialed Alexandra's number. "Claire," she answered immediately, concern evident in her voice. "Are you all right? It's been weeks since you've called." "I need to see you," I said simply. "There have been developments." "I'll come to you," she offered without hesitation. "Just give me the address." "No," I replied, a new certainty forming within me. "I'm coming back. It's time to stop hiding." 2 days later, I sat in Alexandra's Boston office, having shared with her the complete, unvarnished truth, including the contents of both Mr. Peterson's revelations. She listened without interruption, her expression shifting from shock to anger, to deep compassion. "What will you do now?" she asked when I had finished. "I need to talk to James," I said, the decision crystallizing as I spoke it. "He deserves to know the truth about his parentage, about Marianne, About all of it. Not to reconcile. That's impossible. But because keeping these secrets has already caused too much damage. Alexandra nodded slowly. And after that? I looked out her office window at the Boston skyline, considering the question. I don't know exactly, but I think it's time for Claire Montgomery to exist again. Not to reclaim my old life, that's gone, but to build something new that honors both who I was and who I've become. The Claire I knew was a school teacher, Alexandra observed. The Catherine I've come to know is a brilliant legal mind. Perhaps there's a way to combine those identities into something meaningful. Her words stirred something in me, a vision of possibility I hadn't considered before. Maybe not as a judge, I mused, but there are other ways to use a law degree, ways to help people who've been victimized by the powerful, who need someone to stand up for them. Alexandra smiled. I might know some people who could use someone, with your particular perspective and skills. When you're ready. I nodded, feeling a sense of purpose beginning to take root. First, I need to deal with the past. Then I can think about the future. 1 week later, I sat in a small, neutral meeting, room Alexandra had arranged at her firm's offices. My heart pounded as I waited, wondering if James would actually show up, if he would listen, if this impossible conversation would bring closure or simply open new wounds. The door opened and he entered, thinner than I remembered, with new lines, etched around his eyes and mouth. He stopped short when he saw me, confusion flickering across his face. Judge Lawson? He said uncertainly. I don't understand. My attorney said this meeting was about new evidence in my case. It is, I replied softly. But I'm not Judge Lawson, not anymore. I watched as recognition dawned in his eyes, as disbelief gave way to shock. Claire? He whispered, his voice barely audible. How is this possible? It's a long story, I said. One I think we both need to hear completely. Please sit down. What I have to tell you will change everything you think you know about your life, and mine. As he sank into the chair across from me, I took a deep breath and began to speak, unfolding the twisted history that had brought us to this point. I spoke of Marianne, of Harold's decades of deception, of my grandmother's well-intentioned silence. I showed him the documents, the photographs, the evidence of his true origins. He listened in stunned silence, color draining from his face as the implications became clear. When I finally finished, he buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I never knew, he said finally, looking up with reddened eyes. Any of it. He never told me I was adopted, let alone this. All these years, everything he did, pushing me toward you, the fraud attempt, all of it, was because... In his twisted mind, he believed the Montgomery fortune partly belonged to you as Marianne's son. I finished for him. He used us both as pawns in a game that began before we were born. James shook his head slowly, visibly trying to process it all. What happens now? It was the same question Alexandra had asked, but coming from James, it carried different weight. What did happen now between two people bound by blood, divided by betrayal, and united by the experience of being victims of the same monstrous deception? Now we both decide who we want to be going forward, I said carefully. Separately, but with the truth finally between us instead of secrets. I don't know if forgiveness is possible or even appropriate for everything that's happened, but I do know that continuing to live in reaction to Harold's manipulations gives him power he doesn't deserve. James nodded slowly. I've been doing a lot of thinking since the trial, about the kind of man I became under my father's, under Harold's influence, about the person I want to be instead. He met my eyes directly. I'm sorry, Claire. For everything. Not just what I did, but for who I was. You deserved better. It wasn't enough. Nothing could be enough to erase the past. But it was something. A beginning of sorts. Not to reconciliation, but perhaps to mutual liberation from the toxic legacy that had ensnared us both. As we parted ways that day, I felt a strange lightness. The truth, in all its ugly complexity, had finally been spoken. The secrets that had poisoned 3 generations of my family had been dragged into the light. Whatever came next, for me, for James, for all of us, would at least be built on honesty rather than deception. I walked out of Alexandra's office, building into the bright afternoon sunlight, tilting my face upward to feel its warmth. For the first time in a decade, I was neither running from the past nor consumed by it. I was simply present, ready to move forward one step at a time into whatever future I chose to create. Claire Montgomery was back, not unchanged, not unscathed, but alive and free at last. 2 years passed more quickly than I would have imagined possible. Spring had returned to Boston, cherry blossoms dotting the common with delicate pink as I walked to my office near the courthouse. The Montgomery Justice Foundation occupied a modest brownstone, its mission emblazoned on a simple brass plaque. By the door, advocating for victims of financial exploitation and abuse of power. I had established the foundation 18 months earlier, using a portion of my inheritance to create an organization that provided legal representation to people who had been victimized by powerful individuals or institutions. We specialized in cases involving elder financial abuse, corrupt officials, and predatory business practices. Situations where the average person stood little chance against adversaries with far greater resources and influence. Our small team included 4 attorneys besides myself, 2 paralegals, and a dedicated investigator who had previously worked with Alexandra's firm. We took cases based on merit rather than ability to pay, offering those who had been wronged something I had once desperately needed myself, an advocate who understood both the legal system and the personal devastation that accompanied being victimized by the powerful. I had reclaimed my identity as Claire Montgomery professionally, though many people still occasionally called me Catherine from habit. The story of my dual identity had briefly made headlines when I decided to go public. Former judge reveals secret past as victim in corruption case. But the media storm had subsided relatively quickly. In legal circles, my unusual path to and from the bench had become something of a curiosity, occasionally referenced in ethics discussions or law review articles about judicial impartiality. As I unlocked the foundation's front door, my phone buzzed with a text from Alexandra. Bail hearing set for 2 p.m. Still want to attend? I paused before responding. Harold Bennett's appeal had been moving through the system with the glacial pace typical of high-profile cases. His legal team had managed to get a hearing on his motion for bail pending the appeal's outcome, arguing that new evidence warranted reconsideration of the original denial. Yes, I texted back. I'll be there. I hadn't seen Harold since the day of sentencing 2 years earlier. I'd heard he was struggling to adjust to prison life, his health declining, his once formidable presence diminished by the realities of incarceration. Part of me, a small, vindictive part I tried to suppress, felt satisfaction knowing he was experiencing a fraction of the powerlessness he had inflicted on others. But another part recognized that continuing to center him in my emotional landscape, even through hatred, gave him a power over me I was determined to relinquish. I spent the morning reviewing case files, meeting with clients, and guiding our newest attorney through the complexities of a particularly challenging elder abuse case. At 1:30, I left the office and walked the short distance to the courthouse where I had once presided as Judge Lawson. The courtroom was less crowded than I expected. Harold Bennett's fall from grace was old news now, the spectacle of his conviction, no longer drawing the morbidly curious public. I slipped into a seat in the back row, just as the proceedings began. Harold looked markedly different from the powerful, intimidating figure I remembered. Prison had aged him dramatically. His shoulders, stooped, his formerly immaculate silver hair now sparse and unkempt. When he turned to speak to his attorney, I caught a glimpse of his profile, the arrogant set of his jaw now slack and uncertain. The hearing proceeded with familiar rhythms, arguments about flight risk and new evidence washing over me like background noise. I found myself studying Harold not with anger or fear, but with a kind of detached fascination. This man had once loomed so large in my life, a malevolent force that had nearly destroyed everything I valued. Now he seemed reduced, diminished not just physically but in the power he held over my perception. The judge, a former colleague I knew to be fair-minded and thorough, denied the bail request, finding insufficient change in circumstances to warrant revision of the original decision. Harold's shoulders slumped visibly at the ruling, his attorney placing a consoling hand on his arm as he whispered something in his client's ear. As the courtroom began to clear, Harold suddenly looked up, his gaze sweeping the gallery before landing directly on me. For a moment, recognition flickered in his eyes, not of Claire Montgomery, whom he would expect to look different after a decade, but of Judge Catherine Lawson, whose face he had studied throughout his trial. I held his gaze steadily, neither hostile nor triumphant, simply present. Then, with a slight nod of acknowledgement, I stood and walked out of the courtroom, leaving Harold Bennett to whatever thoughts our brief connection had provoked. Outside on the courthouse steps, I took a deep breath of spring air, feeling unexpectedly lighter. The encounter, brief as it was, had confirmed something important. Harold Bennett no longer held power over me, not over my emotions, my choices, or my future. He was simply a man facing the consequences of his actions, as we all must eventually. My phone rang as I descended the steps, a number I recognized immediately, though it rarely appeared on my caller ID. "Hello, James," I answered, my tone neutral. "But not cold." "Claire," he replied, his voice tentative as always in our infrequent communications. "I heard about my father's hearing today. I thought you might be there." "I was," I confirmed. "The request was denied." A pause. "How did he look?" "Older. Tired." I hesitated. "How are you doing?" Our relationship, if it could be called that, existed in a peculiar liminal space. Not reconciliation, not friendship, but something like distant kinship. After our initial meeting 2 years ago, we had maintained sporadic contact, occasional text messages or brief calls acknowledging major developments in the ongoing legal proceedings or personal milestones. James had served his sentence, reduced, to 18 months for cooperation with further investigations, and was now working at a small architectural firm in Vermont, rebuilding his life far from Lakeside and the shadow of the Bennett name. He had divorced Nicole shortly after learning the truth about his parentage, a clean break that seemed to offer him some measure of freedom from his past. "I'm doing all right," he replied. "The firm is keeping me busy, and I've been volunteering with a prison literacy program. It's healing in a way I didn't expect." "That's good to hear," I said, and meant it. James's journey toward redemption was his own, neither my responsibility nor my concern, but I didn't begrudge him the opportunity to become someone better than the man Harold had raised him to be. "Claire," he said after a moment, "there's something else. I've been going through therapy, working on taking responsibility for my actions. My therapist suggested that making amends is important when possible." He trailed off, uncertainty evident in his voice. "What are you asking, James?" "I'd like to make a donation to your foundation," he said finally. "A significant one. Not as a way to buy forgiveness or ease my conscience, but because I believe in the work you're doing, helping people who've been victimized by people like my father. Like I was." I considered his offer carefully. The foundation could certainly use additional funding to take on more cases, expand our services. But accepting money from James carried emotional complications I needed to weigh. "Why don't you send a proposal in writing?" I suggested finally. The board and I can review it and decide if it aligns with our mission and values." "Of course," he agreed quickly. "That makes sense. Thank you for considering it." After we hung up, I continued walking, no particular destination in mind. The city bustled around me, people hurrying about their lives, each carrying their own stories, their own secrets, their own pains and triumphs invisible to passers-by. I found myself at the entrance to the public garden, drawn to its orderly beauty and quiet paths. Finding an empty bench beside the lagoon, I sat and watched families guiding swan boats across the water, children laughing, couples strolling hand in hand. Ordinary moments of joy untouched by the kind of darkness I had experienced. Xiao. Phone buzzed again. This time a message from my assistant at the foundation, alerting me to a call from a potential new client. An elderly woman whose grandson had systematically drained her retirement accounts while serving as her financial manager. A familiar story with personal resonance. As I read the details, I felt that sense of purpose that had become my most reliable companion over the past 2 years. The work wasn't always easy. It involved confronting human cruelty and greed daily, but it provided something essential: the opportunity to transform my own trauma into advocacy for others, to use everything I had learned through my ordeal, to ensure others didn't face similar journeys alone. I texted back that I would take the case personally, then slipped my phone into my pocket and allowed myself a few more minutes of spring sunshine before heading back to the office. That evening, I stood at the window of my apartment overlooking the Charles River, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. My life had settled into a rhythm that felt, if not completely familiar, then at least sustainable. I had friends, real ones this time, people who knew my full story and accepted me as I was. I had meaningful work that engaged both my intellect and my empathy. I had reclaimed my name, my history, my identity, all the pieces of myself that had been fragmented and scattered by the Bennett's actions. What I didn't have was complete closure, and I was beginning to accept that perhaps such a thing didn't exist outside of fiction. Real healing wasn't a destination, but a process, ongoing and imperfect. Some days the weight of everything that had happened pressed more heavily than others. Some nights I still woke from dreams where I was trapped. In that courthouse, my true identity forever concealed, justice forever just beyond reach. But those moments no longer defined me. They were simply threads in a tapestry that included many others. Moments of professional triumph when we won cases for deserving clients. Quiet evenings with Alexandra discussing everything and nothing. Mornings when I woke feeling genuinely optimistic about the day ahead. My grandmother's letter, that final communication from beyond the grave, remained in my bedside drawer, a reminder of both the painful secrets that had shaped my life and the unconditional love that had sustained me through my darkest hours. I no longer read it regularly, but knowing it was there offered a strange comfort, a tangible link to the woman whose principles continued to guide me even after learning of her imperfect choices. My phone rang, interrupting my reflections. It was Meredith Calloway, my former divorce attorney, who now served on the Foundation's board of directors. "Claire," she said when I answered, "I just heard about Harold Bennett's bail hearing. Thought you might want to know they're transferring him to the medical facility at Fort Devens tomorrow. Apparently, his health has deteriorated significantly." I absorbed this information, searching myself for any strong emotional reaction, triumph, satisfaction, pity, and finding none. "Thank you for letting me know," I replied simply. "How are you feeling about it?" she asked, the directness that had made her an excellent attorney evident in her tone. I considered the question carefully. "I'm feeling free," I said finally. "His fate is his own now as mine is mine. There's a certain peace in that." After we hung up, I returned to the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new opportunities to use everything I had learned through my journey for something constructive. The past would always be there, its lessons and scars a part of my foundation, but it no longer controlled my present or defined my future. I thought of James and his tentative steps toward amends, of Harold diminished in his prison uniform, of Vivian who had completed her house arrest and reportedly moved to Florida to live with a sister. The Bennetts, once so central to my existence that my entire identity had been reconstructed in response to their actions, were now peripheral figures in my story. The realization brought with it a sense of completion so profound it almost took my breath away. This, I understood suddenly, was what moving on truly meant. Not forgetting or forgiving necessarily, but finding that the people who once held such power over your life have become supporting characters rather than antagonists in your ongoing narrative. I switched on a lamp as darkness settled over the city, casting a warm glow throughout the apartment. Then I picked up the case file I'd brought home, settling into my favorite chair to review the details of my new client's situation. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of helping another person navigate the aftermath of betrayal, drawing on both my legal knowledge and my lived experience to light a path forward. The story of the Bennetts and their impact on my life would always be a significant chapter in my history. But it was no longer the story I was living. I had written myself a new one, a story of resilience, of purpose, of a life reclaimed from those who had tried to destroy it. A story still unfolding, page by page, day by day, entirely my own. And that, in the end, was the most complete justice I could have asked for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.